So before I get into the review, something interesting I noticed while I was rewatching this movie, Sabrina Carpenter is in this. She plays like the younger version of one of the main characters, and I was so shocked. I was like, what the hell is this? Sabrina Carpenter? Like young Sabrina Carpenter? And then I looked into it. Apparently she was a very notable and successful child actress before she became a singer. Like I was looking at her filmography and I was like, wait, she was in the show Girl Meets World and Milo Murphy's Law? Like, I remember those shows. I didn't realize that was her. So, good for you, Sabrina Carpenter, honestly. Bravo. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor. Welcome to Underground Cinema. This week we'll be talking about the dark fantasy mystery horror film Horns, starring Daniel Radcliffe and Juno Temple. Juno Temple probably being best known for her role in Ted Lasso. She's amazing in that show. If you guys haven't seen Ted Lasso, see Ted Lasso. Funny thing, I think this movie is actually the first movie I've reviewed since Bad Taste where I actually do have the physical media to watch. So that's nice. Streaming. Anyway, Horns is a dark fantasy film that's adapted from a book written by Joe Hill, who is actually the son of famous horror author Stephen King. Now, Horns actually came out 10 years ago, and I actually did see this movie when it came out. I really enjoyed it. Prior to this review, I think I've actually seen this film about 2 or 3 times. I really enjoyed it when I was a teen. And what's there not to enjoy? You have basically Harry Potter being forced to become the devil. It's a really entertaining film. But watching this movie, I was wondering whether or not it would hold up. And I think for the most part it does. For those of you who don't know, the plot of the film is that basically you have the character of Ignatius Perrish. Everyone calls him Ig for short. And when the movie begins, Ig has been falsely accused of murdering his girlfriend. The reason he's accused of this is because everyone saw the two of them arguing the night that she was killed. Now obviously he's really frustrated by the fact that people in his hometown keep harassing him over a crime he didn't commit, but something that bothers him even more is the fact that his girlfriend, who he loved, who he was about to propose to, was taken away from him. Now one day his anger materializes and he wakes up with horns growing out of his head. At first he thinks he's going crazy, then he figures out that they are real, and no one reacts poorly to them because apparently the horns give off this effect where you kind of forget about them when you look away from them, very similar to like the silence in Doctor Who. Anyway, obviously the first thing he tries to do is get them removed, but that doesn't really work out. Funny thing, the doctor in this movie that Ig goes to get the horns removed reminds me a lot of Kevin Spacey's character from American Beauty. Then he discovers that the horns give him other abilities. Whenever he's speaking to someone, the person who interacts with him just feels compelled to not only divulge their deepest, darkest secret, but also act on their darkest impulses. Ig himself can also tempt people to indulge in those impulses. It's very similar to like how Tom Ellis uses his eyes in the show Lucifer. Ig also has the ability to see the crimes that someone has committed just by touching them physically, which obviously very similar to the Bruce Willis Unbreakable ability. Come to think of it, these horns have like a lot of similarities with other things in fiction. Anyway, Ig is frustrated for a little bit, but then he discovers that he can use the horns to figure out who actually killed his girlfriend. So he does a little detective work, he starts figuring out different things, piecing things together. An interesting thing, though, in the film is that the only person who can't see the horns is his best friend and lawyer, Lee. Now, this is actually foreshadowing as we find out later in the film that Lee is the one who actually did kill Ig's girlfriend, Marin. Turns out Lee was kind of like an r/nice guy and was really tired of being in the friend zone with Marin because he always felt like he should have ended up with her and not Ig. In any case, Lee tries to kill Ig, makes it look like a suicide, but Ig comes out looking rad as hell. The film goes into sort of this mystical, high-concept area where his horns disappear with the power of a cross. So since he's not dead and looks normal now, he takes advantage of the situation to re-confront Lee, who does not remember anything, because as mentioned, the horns make you forget as well. He takes Lee to the spot where he killed Marin. They have a final confrontation. Ig then sprouts wings and starts flying? Silly Ig Perrish, don't you know that's not how you fly? Wingardium Leviosa. Daniel Radcliffe completes his full satanic transformation. He punishes Lee not only by stabbing him with the horns, but also by having Lee get strangled to death by snakes. Funny thing, second movie I've reviewed in a row where a central character gets, like, wrapped around by snakes. Gender equality, I guess. And then the film ends with Ig dying, but it's okay because it's heavily implied that he's going to be with Marin now. Now, this film is pretty great. It's not as good as I remember it being. Some notable flaws that I picked up on during my rewatch is that the film, obviously being a book adaptation, features a good amount of narration from Daniel Radcliffe, and it sounds like Radcliffe is phoning in the narration, unfortunately. Another thing I noticed is that while Radcliffe doesn't do a bad job in the role, in fact, he does an amazing job as the character of Ig Perrish, his American accent isn't great. Now, I can't judge him too harshly. This was only like his second or third role after Harry Potter, and I think this actually might have been the first role he played where he plays an American character, but he's not nailing the accent. I've heard him do better accents in later films like Guns Akimbo. That being said, Daniel Radcliffe's accent definitely sounds better whenever he's angry in the film. Like when he's yelling at someone or like in a fight, the accent sounds more natural. And I think that is reflective of what at the time was his growing talent as a performer. Also, Horns, I think, is the first fantasy movie that Daniel Radcliffe did after Harry Potter, which is pretty interesting. Funny thing as well, this film is not as dour as I remember it being. Like, it's definitely a somber movie. Like, the death of the character of Marin sort of looms over this entire film. It is very sad, but I remember the film being a lot darker, and it's not. There is, like, a sort of soft comedic element to this movie. I would definitely say that there are moments that help lighten things up before things get really dark, which I think is necessary for a story like this. Now, it's never clear in the movie why the horns show up. I think I read an explanation online that the reason they showed up is because Ig had a one-night stand with Glenna, so him committing the sin of adultery resulted in him getting the horns as like a punishment. But if you ask me, I feel like the reason he got the horns is because literally the night before he pissed on a bunch of religious paraphernalia. Like, the horns were just God answering him saying like, hey, if you want justice, here you go. Here's the tools to get your justice for you. Or maybe it was the devil. I don't know. I think the best thing about this film is just the sheer amount of symbolism in it. This is a movie that is absolutely teeming with visual and thematic symbolism, and it doesn't stop with the horns. There's smaller things in the film that I think help communicate visually what the plot's about or where the plot will lead. I think one of the first instances you see in this movie is where the character of Glenna, after her one-night stand with Ig, is watching an old Tom and Jerry cartoon with the dog as like a devil. And obviously that's meant to tie in to the fact that Ig has just had his horns grow in. And I really do enjoy that when a character is just watching an old cartoon for something and it ties in directly to the plot. Sort of like how in Five Nights at Freddy's, immediately after those guys break into Freddy's, it pans to Josh Hutcherson's sister as she's watching an old cartoon of like an animal swallowing. There's also symbolism in the costume design. The leather jacket that Ig wears has like a big sort of arrow slot down the middle, and it feels like that's where the wings are supposed to pop out later in the film. So I think that's a bit of visual foreshadowing. There's also like this small detail near the end of the film where Ig dies and he looks into the tree where him and Marin always spent time together, and he sees like a light sparkling there, and it's very reminiscent of his first meeting with Marin when they were kids, and she was shining a light in his eyes like Morse code, and that's obviously supposed to give him a sense of peace as he's being carried into the next life. And then there's how the end and the beginning of the film sort of mirror each other. So the film opens up with this scene with Ig and Marin talking about how in love they are with each other. And as the scene ends, the camera sort of sinks into the ground and it shows Ig just asleep on the ground with an empty alcohol bottle next to him. And that's obviously meant to show how Ig's character has sort of descended into hell after this terrible event of his girlfriend being murdered. But as the film ends, it replays that same scene, but instead of the camera sinking into the ground, the camera ascends into the sky, and I think that's supposed to be visual symbolism for Ig and Marin being at peace together in heaven. And that's also hammered home in the credits, because as the credits roll, you see beautiful visual illustrations of like angels together. This film also does an amazing job sort of recontextualizing the classic story of the devil. I never read the original Joe Hill novel, but I imagine the story of Ig Perrish is supposed to mirror that of Lucifer in Paradise Lost, where the devil is more portrayed as a tragic figure as opposed to a villain. And as the film goes on, Ig definitely adopts more of like the satanic qualities that would be expected of that sort of character. It isn't just the horns. It seems like one of his central flaws is his temper, which obviously adds to his devilish behavior. He finds in the movie that snakes are very much attracted to him, and the deceitful serpent's obviously a classic piece of biblical imagery that's tied to the devil. He starts carrying around a pitchfork as well as his primary weapon, and just like you would expect the devil to do, he starts punishing those who are guilty. He's basically like a tragic anti-hero, someone who is taking vengeance, but he's doing it to only people who deserve it. But there are some sympathetic aspects to him. One of the people in this film that he helps is this character of Glenna, who has actually been in love with Ig since they were kids, but Ig was always with Marin. And Ig tells her in this movie, listen, if you want to leave this town, you should. You shouldn't wait around for me. You should go. Live your life. It's really a bizarre love square that's in this film. He also helps his childhood friend, who is a cop, embrace his repressed sexual urges and actually be with someone that society wouldn't approve of. And it shows that Ig in this movie isn't a complete monster, that he isn't out to just punish the guilty, that he is willing to help people when they need it. As far as modern interpretations of the devil go, I think this is a good one. I do have a small nitpick, though, about the horns. So, the horns in the film are brown, which is a naturalistic color. I think that was the best choice for them to make. But Daniel Radcliffe is also a brunette. So early on in the film, when the horns are growing out, they blend in with his hair a lot. Obviously, as the horns get longer, they become more distinctive and more noticeable. But it is a consistent issue, the fact that the horns blend in with his hair. And who knows, maybe that was intentional? Maybe it's supposed to add to the idea that you don't really notice the horns until you get up close to him. But I don't know, I just feel like if Daniel Radcliffe was blonde, the horns would have definitely been more imposing in the film. Then again, it's probably best that they didn't put him in a wig or try to bleach his hair. It most likely would have looked weird. And it also would have looked weird with any other actor that they casted in this movie. I mean, apparently, one of the top choices prior to Daniel Radcliffe was actually Shia LaBeouf. And that would have looked awful if he was blonde. It also would have made the film worse if he was the main character, but... Now, all that being said, obviously this film features a lot of biblical and satanic references. It does feel like a modern interpretation of Paradise Lost. But the real tragic element of this story isn't the fantasy aspects, it's how this whole terrible plot unfolded. The characters of Ig and Marin fell in love as children. They've dated their entire lives, and in the background the entire time was Ig's best friend Lee, who was also in love with Marin. And Lee feels like he's the one who should have ended up with Marin, because Lee's the one who fixed Marin's cross. He's always felt like the two of them have had an unspoken connection with each other. He also saved Ig's life as a kid when he was drowning, and he says in this movie that saving Ig's life was the worst mistake he ever made. And that is the real tragedy of this movie, the fact that the main character's best friend ended up murdering a woman that the both of them loved. And that terrible act just destroyed everything. The only thing that's more tragic than the actual events of this film would be Marin's character herself. Turns out the reason her and Ig were arguing the night she died is because she broke up with him. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she found out she had the same cancer that killed her mother, and she didn't want to put Ig through that. So she figured it'd be easier to break his heart up front than let his heart break over the long battle with her cancer. She's such a sympathetic character, and it's really tragic that we only get to see her in this movie via flashback. But anyway, yeah, horns. Like I said, the movie isn't as good as I remember it being, but it is definitely a good film. It's tragic, and it's beautiful, and I think it just shows how powerful true love is, as corny as that sounds. So yeah, that was my review of Horns. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. Follow me on Letterboxd or Instagram if you want to hear more of my film takes, and I will see you later. Small thing I wanted to add about this movie. I'm not sure how many of you remember this, but there's a song that plays in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 called "Oh Children" by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. It plays in that scene where Harry is dancing with Hermione, and just how somber that song feels. It seems like a song that you would have put in this movie. Like, it just fits thematically. Like, obviously the filmmakers made this movie the way they did. Maybe they didn't even think about that song. I'm just saying, I feel like you should put it in. Personally. Just putting that out there.